Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. I'd like to welcome you all to the event organized by the Wilfried Martens Centre for European Studies. I am very glad that the house is full, despite all circumstances. But I understand your interest. I know why you are so keen to listen these two gentlemen, or three gentlemen. This is because the West, or we Europeans, we face a number of challenges that matter a lot. The EU suffers from its internal division. You may know that the Article 7 of the Lisbon Treaty has been triggered towards Poland and towards Hungary. We are troubled with regard to the United Kingdom and with the question how to organize our future mutual relations. A major preoccupation these days is how to image immigration. Look at Greece of these days. But also how to make our neighborhood more stable. We can speak about Libya, we can speak about the Middle East in general, but especially about Syria in particular. Looking at the picture from the other side of the Atlantic, it is obvious that the United States has a sitting president who doesn't belong to the most enthusiastic persons when it comes to multilateral cooperation or defense of our values, the values of liberal democracy. And China elbows its way forward with a disdain for the principles, for the tenets of liberal democracy. So we all feel that the West's attractiveness to others has dropped in the past few decades. So it is natural that the Westerners, the Democrats, are asking, why? What is happening? Is liberal democracy going to a stalemate? If so, what principles represent the perspective? So, my friends, the book which is going to be presented and discussed here today constitutes, I strongly believe, a solid foundations for our quest for answers. And I am very pleased and honored that I can welcome and introduce one of its author, Ivan Krastev, a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna and the chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia. I am pretty sure that in this community, deeper introduction of this gentleman is not needed, but our moderator will do this. For the discussion with Mr. Krastev, we have another heavyweight, Radosław Sikorski, former National Defense Minister, Foreign Affairs Minister, the Marshal of the Sejm in Poland, but also a great thinker who was named one of the top 100 global thinkers by Foreign Policy magazine in 2012 for telling the truth even when it is not diplomatic. Mr. Sikorski currently serves as the member of the European Parliament. So, dear Ivan, dear Radek, many thanks for accepting our invitation. We are extremely proud and happy to have you here. Our discussion will be moderated by Roland Freudenstein, the policy director of the Martens Centre. So, dear friends, on the book cover, Timothy Snyder writes, this is a book about copying that makes an original argument. In doing so, it reminds us that the liberal democracy depends not on mechanical processes, but on human originality. And I am pretty sure that we will hear today a lot of original and inspiring ideas. Enjoy the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, President. Actually, the speakers already have been introduced, but I may add a few points. Ivan Krastev has written many books, but the one he wrote before The Light That Failed, if I remember correctly, was called After Europe.
Yeah.
And it focused more on the Central and East European events of the last 30 years. Whereas The Light That Failed also starts with that, but then kind of projects the whole pattern onto the rest of the world, and first and foremost to Russia and China. But the leitmotif, if I may say so, the leitmotif is something went wrong, let's look what went wrong, and then let's look what we can do about it. Anyway, Radek Sikorski is the author of a meme that I actually used for one of my most successful op-eds in Poland 20 years ago, when at a reception, you know that the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, whose director I was in Warsaw at the time, Konrad Adenauer Foundation was famous and, I should say, sometimes even criticized by Polish conservatives for being too close to the liberal elites, so to speak, which at the time, the party of the liberal elites was the Freedom Union, the Union of Freedom, Unia Wolności. So Radek said to me, half jokingly, yeah, you guys like those Freedom Union people because they can eat with a knife and fork.
Unlike us.
Yes, precisely, which is, of course, the first idiosyncrasy in this whole thing, you know? I mean, much of the anti-elitist and anti-intellectual criticism in Central Europe these days comes from intellectuals who have just chosen a different path for at least a time. But, you know, things change over time. Anyway, what I wanted to say is that we have two speakers here who have been, for many years, in these debates about democracy, worldwide democracy, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, the old East-West conflict, and the new ideological debates that are happening now in the European Union and beyond. So without further ado, I would like first Ivan to present the core theses of his book, The West That Failed, then Radek Sikorski to give an answer to that. And if he hasn't been critical enough on Ivan, then I will add to that. Thank you very much. Ivan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Really, thank you very much for the opportunity and presentation. You can be sure that you can rely on Radek. But what I'll try to do is basically really very much briefly giving the argument and start with the fact of what this book is not. Let's start with the title. The Light That Failed is the title that we borrowed from the first novel of Kipling for a very simple reason. This book has two different versions. His mother asked him to write a book which is short and optimistic. And being a good son, he did it. But at the same time, because he was not in a very optimistic mood, he came also with another version, which was longer and not so much optimistic. Our publisher didn't give us an opportunity to have two different versions, optimistic and pessimistic, of the book. So we set with the title, you can read it as optimistic or pessimistic because we're not sure how it works. Secondly, this is not an angry book, and from this point of view, this is very important for us. Many people are writing books saying, if only we have done this and that. I don't know what we could have done differently and how it was going to be different. And this is, also keep in mind, this is a book which we did with Stephen Holmes, and most probably if you like something in the book, it was written by Stephen, not by me. Good to know. Yeah, but what was important for us is when we look back at the last 30 years, and people are talking rise of populism. People like populism because we can put there anything that we want. We wanted to try to see, is there a certain moment that has finished and what was at the core of this moment. And this is our major argument. There was a moment. And this moment has a very specific characteristics, and some of the successes and some of the failures that we see, both of them are rooted in the uniqueness of this moment. So in 1989, a vice president of the United States back then was a guy called Dan Quayle. Dan Quayle was not famous for intellectual input. He was the favorite of the American stand-up comedians. He was doing gaffes all the time, but he said something very wise in 1989. He said, what we're witnessing today is an irreversible trend towards more freedom and more democracy, but of course this could change. And from this point of view, trying to see why he was right that it was irreversible, but also that it has changed is quite important. And what we did in the book is we went back to Fukuyama's The End of History, and people like to try to ridicule Fukuyama, but there is nothing to be ridiculed. And by the way, keep in mind, this was a piece, his original article, written in the spring of 1989. There was no Tiananmen. There was no basically Soviet Union to disintegrate. His argument was a much more simple argument, and to be honest, we have talked with him a lot. In the spring of 1989, he did not expect Soviet Union to disintegrate. But already there, he saw an important disruption. Mainly, Cold War was a clash between two universalist ideologies, all of them rooted basically in the European Enlightenment, and one of them committed a suicide. They basically said, we don't have a claim on the future anymore. This was coming by Gorbachev, this was coming then by the Chinese leadership. By the way, they took a very different idea of what was wrong about socialism. Gorbachev believed that what is bad about socialism was the monopoly of the Communist Party, and what was good was the socialist ideas. Chinese took the opposite story. They believed what was good about communism was the monopoly of the Communist Party, and what was bad basically were the communist ideas. But it was a consensus, and this consensus was not a Western consensus. As a result of it, in 1990, democratic capitalism became the other name for modernity. To be modern means to basically have the institutions and the way of life, which at this moment have been very much associated with the West. And this is why we call these 30 years the Age of Imitation. By the way, imitation is something important because we're imitating all the time. So this is not for the first time in history. The very fact that we can walk is because we imitate people walking. But there was something very specific about these 30 years. First, really in order to be modern, you should have the institutions that the West has, to have the values that the West has. And it was the choice of the people on the other side to do it. Imitation is not imposition and is not colonization. And for me, this is critically important distinction. In 1990, the key word in Central and Eastern Europe was normality. We wanted to be a normal country. We wanted to have a normal life. And normality means the way of the West. And this was shared so much that I was basically seeing, as you know, in Germany, they publish postcards with the notes that Schabowski has taken when he announced opening of the Berlin Wall. One of the words that he was taking was normality. And normality is a critical concept to understand 1989. Why I'm saying this? Because imitating and starting to imitate Western institutions, of course, took a different form in different places. For Central and Eastern Europeans, it was also the idea of the return to Europe. And I do believe, basically, we have imitating successfully, and we were imitating in order to transform ourselves. But, and this is the first part of our argument, after a certain period of time, what was perceived as success started to be perceived as disadvantage, and basically, we do not want to be imitators, we want to have basically an identity of our own, became the major slogan coming from some of the illiberal populist leaders. And this is what basically we got reading them. So we didn't invent this for them. You basically read people, members of the EPP and people not members of the EPP on this side, and you're going to see how important for them is the story. And our question was where the problems comes from. And in my view, it comes much more from psychology than from anywhere else. Being an imitator is a difficult position even when you yourself decided to imitate certain institutions, because it means that you recognize that the other one is better than you. If I want to be like you, I recognize that you are better than me. Certainly, this is an antagonistic relationship. If I want to be like you, I want to replace you. And thirdly, what is very important was that the process of the European integration and the way basically the European integration goes makes in many places imitation very much kind of a literal. You're adopting legislation, you're adopting institutions, you're adopting a language. So this created this resource for political mobilization that came in Eastern Europe. Russia is a different story. In 1990s, Russia was much more in the modus of surviving. And for them, basically, the story was imitating institutions in order basically to protect itself from the world that they didn't understand and which they see as very much hostile. But what was much more important is that when you go back particularly to 2000s and try to understand the idea of managed democracy that was very then popular in the Russian, we should ask different questions than we're normally asking about Russia. Because normally the question is, oh, you see, they have our institutions, but obviously this is not the same type of institutions because there are one thing that in Russia, two things that you cannot choose, your parents and your president. So why then basically you talk about democracy? The interesting question that I do believe we asked about Russia was, why even in 2004, President Putin decided to rig elections, which he could have won if they were free and fair, and why he rigged it in the way that everybody knew that they rigged. And our major argument was that managed democracy is much more about faking management than faking democracy. The moment when you have a rigged elections that nobody protests, you try to show that you do not have alternative and you're totally in charge. And when in 2011, 2012, people went on the street and protested the rigged elections, this mode of legitimation failed and came the next one. The next one was very much based on foreign policy, and then comes the second form of the Russian imitation. We are going to imitate the American foreign policy in order to show that we are not different. So then comes the annexation of Crimea, in which the Russian president is reading his famous speech for the annexation, and the whole passage of it is taken from the position of the Western leaders on the recognition of Kosovo. And the story is, I can delegitimize the liberal order without offering an alternative. I'm just going to try to show that we are not different. And this explains, in my view, certain things that otherwise are not easy to be explained. For example, when the Russian president said that there were no special forces in Crimea, this is a lie, but normally presidents do not lie on this level because this is a lie that cannot be denied. You know the name of the people that were there. So this is not something that basically is, and he gave them medals, by the way, 2 weeks later. So he lied in order to be called a liar, in order to say liar like you. What about the weapons for mass destruction in Iraq? And I do believe that this mode of exposing the hypocrisy of the West became the major mode of foreign policy of the Russian Federation. And this is why the imitation started to be used as a strategy for subversion. And then we went to the United States and asked a very simple question. You can understand easily why the imitator feels uncomfortable in the world that you should imitate somebody else. How it happened that President Trump managed to convince a big part of the American society that America is the biggest loser of the last 30 years. How it happened that the imitated started to believe that the world that is imitating them is not in their interest. And from this point of view, I really want to keep it very short, but I do believe that there was 3 important changes coming with the President Trump, which are not going to change easily, nevertheless, how these elections are going to go. One is that the American exceptionalism is a vulnerability for the United States. The message was we don't need to be better than others. We should be simply stronger than others. The other was that many things that Americans believe was good for America, or bad for America, even the spread of the English language. The very fact that everybody speaks English made America blind to the world, because you go, you speak only to the English speakers, and then you have the view of the world which is slightly different than the one that exists. Now everybody knows America. America became transparent for everybody else, while the world remains opaque to the United States. And thirdly, which in my view is very important, and this is something that makes President Trump closer to some of the leaders that we also see in our countries, politics is a zero-sum game. For me, in order to win, somebody should lose. And the idea of the victory understanding as basically somebody should lose, I do believe is very kind of an important for this story. We end up with China. None of us is particularly expert on China, but we wanted to make one important point. There was one country that was never part of the Age of Imitation, and this was China. They borrowed, they were stealing technologies and so on, but they insisted all the time they are not going to imitate the West. Everything is with the Chinese characteristics. And we're making this point because, like probably many in this room, I believe that the conflict between the United States and China are very much going to shape the time to come. But this is not a simple return to the Cold War. China is not an ideological power in the way the Soviet Union was. And for two reasons, China neither wants others to imitate them, because they do believe first, if Russians has a inferiority complex, I do believe that China has a superiority complex, so they don't believe that others can imitate them. But secondly, because in the 1970s, China was exporting ideology even more than the Soviet Union during the Mao period. They simply want to dominate the others, but they don't want to create a replicas of their regimes. You want to have a democracy? Be a democracy. Just do what we ask you to do in the field of the economy, in the kind of strategic areas. So from this point of view, we don't believe we're back to the Cold War. We do believe that authoritarianism by itself is not an ideology. Communism was. Communism has a claim on the future and wanted to transform the world. So, and here I'm ending, our friend Ken Jowett used to say that as a principle, history is Protestant. There are different forms of love coexisting, but they are Catholic moments in which a certain type of an idea or institutions got a global appeal and everybody tries to implement it. So 1989 was the Catholic moment, but now we're back to Protestantism. As somebody who is an Orthodox Christian, this sounds good enough.
Great. Ivan, thank you so much for this short and concise presentation of your theses. I'd like to turn to Radek Sikorski now. And, you know, I'm sure you've got your points prepared, but there's one question from my side. Do you recognize yourself in this description of the former dissidents before '89 and the new elites after '89 as imitation being their most important goal? And imitation, very well understood, not as something totally pejorative, but were you imitating?
Yes, and I'll explain why, but let me start by thanking Ivan for mentioning President Putin and Crimea and weapons of mass destruction. Because my favorite anecdote about President Putin, and I've have it confirmed from two independent sources who heard it, was after the Iraq War at the Valdai conference. One of the American participants said, President Putin, and what do you think about the US role in Iraq? And Putin said, well, the whole case for the war was built on finding weapons of mass destruction, and your government hasn't found the weapons of mass destruction. It completely discredits the case for the war and indeed your intelligence service and your country, doesn't it? And you know what? I don't know why the Americans haven't found weapons of mass destruction. I would have found them. But coming to your question and the thesis, I think this is illuminating and useful, but it doesn't quite explain to me the electoral outcomes. Because yes, it's true that we were thinking in terms of having been wrenched out of the mainstream of Western civilization against our will, and we were thinking in terms of returning to the mainstream, to where we truly belonged. And that meant that we were catching up on 5 decades of missed development. But here's a problem for your thesis. The process of European integration is necessarily imitative, not only for East Europeans. So when Denmark or Sweden or Portugal joins the EU, they also are joining something which already has its body of acquis, and you have to enact it in your national legislation. Well, what can be more imitative than that, right? And you wouldn't pose that thesis onto Sweden. This is where I disagree, because your thesis suggests that there is a brand of politics which is uniquely Central Eastern European that produces different outcomes. And here I disagree, because I think Poland is in the same phase of deglobalization as UK and the United States, quite frankly. And the local characteristics are different. They're psychological, I agree, but different. Poland is split down the middle between traditionalists and integrationists, which in Poland, globalists, which in Poland means integration in the European Union. And remember that what decides who holds power is 2 to 3%. You don't need a huge swing. And to my mind, what changed in Poland in the last 20 years is the attitude of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church supported democratization and supported, perhaps by fluke, because John Paul II was still alive in 2004. There was a faction of the church and of the right wing which was prepared to go full blast against Poland entering the EU. And then the Pope came into our parliament and said, from the Union of Lublin, federation with Lithuania, to the European Union. And that ended the debate. And now it's changed. The Polish Catholic Church has made an intellectual mistake, consisting in the following. To add one fact, Poland is the country in the world which has the biggest generational cleavage in religiosity between people over 30 and under 30. And the Catholic Church has mistakenly blamed this on the European Union. So actually we now have this nationalist sect supporting anti-European language, and I think that accounts for a good few percentage of the vote. And this is important to the part, and I'm finishing, what do we do about it? Because we assume that since we achieved normality takes care of itself. You don't need to educate people about constitutions and the European Union, because what we have is just normality, and normality is stable, right? Well, we've been disabused of that. In Poland, people have the same feeling that capitalism is less fair than it should be. So what do we do about that? Well, we get rid of tax havens. We make sure that transnational corporations and the richest individuals pay their fair share of tax and so on. And then, lastly, look what people like. People like the people who vote for the current government, when asked, say, yeah, we trust them because they said before the election that they'll institute this generous child benefit, and they did it. And for the first time, people got 100 euros for every child every month chipping into the account. They feel, the state is not something abstract. It has done something that has affected my life. And this is what we need to do. We need to, whether in the way that we tackle migration or whether in the way we beef up our defenses, we need to show that the EU can do something. And that, of course, requires resources. And then we come back to the tax havens.
Yeah.
I would like to add one point to this. And when I read your chapter in the beginning of the Light That Failed, which is, again, focusing on Central and Eastern Europe and the elites there, which was the former opposition in the time of communism. and having extensively traveled in Central Europe and especially Poland in the 1980s, before 89, I don't recognize my friends. I don't recognize people like Tadeusz Mazowiecki, Leszek Balcerowicz, Bronisław Geremek. I mean, okay, I wasn't having beers with them all through the 1980s, being a poor student from Bonn University, but I met the people that worked with them. And when you know, just to maybe to caricaturize a little bit your description of these elites after 89, when you write that part of this imitation was wearing Armani suits and playing golf, none of these gentlemen ever wore an Armani suit, not even Hugo Boss, I would claim, and they certainly didn't play golf. And now, coming to the more substantive argument about what Radek called the return, I think there is a deep problem, at least that I have, with using the term imitation, because for all these people that I'm describing here, Westernization was something they felt was the natural state of their countries. Exactly, they had been deprived of this for so and so many decades in communism. But they were returning to a natural state. And the European Union would be the set of institutions that gave this process its intensity, its sequence, and its speed, but not its direction. So, you know, I'm really I'm putting a big question mark here over your general thesis that it was a process of imitation, which is why it created all kinds of psychological side effects, which ended up in the unhealthy, regrettable, or maybe just natural developments of the last 10, 15 years. So, you know, how would you respond to this? And of course, to the very important points that Radek made, and also please answer the question, what to do about it? How does liberal democracy have to behave in the future to improve the situation?
So thank you very much. And this is very important. Of course, what Radek told you, that you're talking too much to the people from the Freedom Union, is true. Talking about Mazowiecki and Geremek, for whom I have a huge respect.
To the others.
No, why I'm going to tell you.
Did.
No. Listen, imitation was not perceived as nothing which is pejorative in the 1990s. If you're going to talk to the people, exactly people like Geremek and Alex Smoller and others, they're going to tell you something very important. The best way to catch up was to do it. The word experiment was perceived as a dirty word. Klaus famously said the third way goes to the third world. And this was a consensus, interestingly, both on the left and on the right. And here is where the problem with the imitation comes from. And this is why now we have this clash of normalities. It's not about, and of course, on the suits and others, it was not the East European chapter, so they're totally not accused of this. As you know, some of them are very close. Yeah, so
no Western
friends,
Balkans,
friends of mine. But the story is much more important, is that you go there, and I do believe part of the problem with the populist governments that you have in Central and Eastern Europe is not very different than the problem with the second generation of migrants that have been very well known in the sociology literature. The third generation comes. And the more basically they are integrated in the host society, the more this is seen as a success. The second generation comes and they start to have the problem of being treated as a second-class citizens. They go back to identity, they go back to tradition. Nevertheless, that what is exactly this tradition is not easy to be defined. But what is important is that normality, and this is the problem of imitating the West. In 3 levels, it was not unproblematic. And the strongest, by the way, case for me to defend, because Radek made a very strong point and very good one about the South Europeans and imitation. Here it was the full package. It was democracy, capitalism, European Union. It was much more radical. Capitalism at least was there for them. But what was interesting is that you're also imitating a model that is all the time changing. In 1989, if you're a conservative Pole, what was the good about the West? Unlike the Soviet society, he said, in the West they believe in God. They're anti-communist, there is a private property, they're very traditional. And for many conservative Poles, this was how they see the West. And now they see, what is this now? They don't believe in God, they believe in a gay marriage, and so on. So these 30 years in which the West itself has been changing, and this is normal, is perceived as the betrayal. And now the idea of the normality is attack on the liberal values is they're not normal. And this is why the problem of gay marriages and others became so high on the agenda. And it's not only Catholic Church. There are countries in which Catholicism is not particularly strong, and you're going to have the same type of traditionalism, which is also a kind of a strange traditionalism because it is not rooted in a kind of alternative idea of society. The second difference was that people expected that in many respects, the transition in Central and Eastern Europe is going very much to resemble the German transition. But there was one major difference. In 1945, nationalism was defeated, I mean morally, politically, militarily in Germany. In 1989, nationalism was part of the victorious coalition in Central and Eastern Europe. It was liberals and nationalists that basically overthrown communism. There was always a strong nationalistic wing in Solidarity. And to be honest, Mr. Kaczynski, I do believe he has his own consistency. Like Mr. Corbyn, he didn't change very much his views for the last 40 years. He can be accused of many things, but lack of consistency is not one of them. Where he was, there he is. Some people like the fact that people are not changing. But for me, this is...
He was, in the 90s, he was denouncing traditionalists. He was denouncing the then Christian nationalists as a party that will de-Christianize Poland, and now he's indistinguishable from them. He's moved too.
But there was a group that didn't move. For example, the father of the current prime minister is where he was.
He stayed in the underground until 1991 or something.
Yeah. So why I'm saying all this is quite important, because as a result of it, the problem of sovereignism and nationalism and so on, I went, of course, through a lot of surveys. And here's the interesting story. For the last 30 years, in some of the Central and East European countries, we didn't see a major change in the nationalistic attitudes. What has changed is that nationalism was muted in the 1990s, and suddenly at a certain point became extremely, extremely loud. And I believe that part of the explanation is first, the Yugoslav wars. This was basically the bloody face of nationalism, but secondly, because nationalism was very much associated with ex-communists. It was Milosevic. For some of these people, basically, association with Milosevic was not something that they'll go for. But there was this, and also the third was the strategic idea. Entering NATO, entering European Union was supported also by many nationalists, but not for the same reasons that it was supported by the liberals. So you have the feeling that there is a common goal, but this common goal has totally different rationale. And I'm going to end up on this. Where is the problem when I talk about this age of imitation? First, and Poland is a great example, most of the colleagues who now try to explain what is happening in Central and Eastern Europe, in my view, are making two mistakes. First, they believe that Central and Eastern Europe is unified space. It is not. We are very different countries, with different economic trajectories, cultures, and so on. For example, Poland still is quite importantly religious society when it comes to the Catholic Church. If you go to the Czech Republic, this is the most secular society in the European Union. Secondly, if you see economically, mostly people try to explain the rise of populism as the mobilization of the losers of the economic reforms. But listen, Poland, since 1992, do not have a recession. Their GDP tripled. Social inequality has declined in the last 10 years. So all the major explanation that goes as an economic explanation does not work.
Okay, now I'll give you an explanation.
Okay.
Part at the cutting edge, the imitation, before we started our accession process, was taking advice of the Marriott Brigade in Warsaw on how to transform the economy.
These were Western consultants that made a fantastic living on the gullible audience that they found.
Actually, they gave perfectly good advice because Poland was a complete basket case. We had inflation of 800%. The country was on its knees. Nothing was working. We were technically bankrupt. We were not servicing our foreign aid. And we got a classic IMF adjustment program with Polish characteristics. But I spoke to one of those consultants who in addition to giving the technical advice, said, yes, so you're choosing this way to capitalism. You'll be much richer, but you'll have complexes. Now, what did he mean? You said imitation was the best way to get to modernity. It wasn't the best, it was the easiest.
Yeah.
Because there were resources, there was a path. There was an alternative, of course. South Korean way was, to keep down standards of living, to squeeze resources out of a very poor country for internal modernization and building up internal capitalist resources. But that, of course, would mean that 20 years later, we would still be poorer. But what would be different would be the structure of ownership of the economy. What these people object to is that, yeah, we are richer, but, there are all these English language signs, the growth is accounted for by foreign companies. Yeah. Millions of people work for foreign companies, and we don't have any brand names. Can you mention a Polish brand name?
Yeah. This is, by the way, extremely important, because you have an imitation in which the model all the time is telling you how well you're doing. It's one thing to imitate Christ. He's never writing country reports. But basically, when you imitate somebody, and somebody all the time is telling you how well you're doing this, by the way, in the beginning, this is very disciplining. And for me, methodologically, the most important is, if you try to explain the last 30 years, we should be trying to explain both the success and the failure. It's not that something failed. There was something that succeeded on transforming.
You see, the more thoughtful proponents of this thesis will not deny the success, but will say, well, but look, for all the growth, the dividends are going back to the countries from where the capital originates. And they miss the fact that, of course, if you weren't in the European Union, you would still be paying the dividends, right? Or they will make an elaborate argument about economic colonization and about how they're sucking out all our best people. And there's something to those arguments.
Totally. No, listen, one of the things that I didn't make a point, because it's very much in the book, it was also partly present in my previous book. So I do believe that one of the factors that was totally underestimated when you try to understand how society's mood has changed was the effect of out-migration, the number of the people that have left the country. And even for me, to be honest, I realized it just during the refugee crisis when you ask questions, come on,
we have a joke with the Lithuanians.
Yeah.
You've lost 1 million people and we've lost 1 million people.
Yeah, exactly, yeah, absolutely. No, but listen, the figures are astonishing for some of the, then again, it's not the same for every country, but only between 2007 and 2017, 3.4 million Romanians has left the country, and around 70% of them are younger than 40. So imagine psychologically, even if you're doing fine, how happy you are in a place which others want to live. And I do believe this is extremely important. Being Bulgarian, I know very much what we talk about, because on one level, opening of the borders was a great opportunity for all of us. You have better education, you have better experience, better job. And then people look around and said, okay, but when we're aging, we're depopulated, our best people are out. And the fear is that European Union is taking our kids and our doctors. And this is a major issue that I do believe is going to come back, because one of the arguments which is not discussed yet, but I'm sure that these governments are going to make, is also money are moving. And this is not simply the dividends. Every money that have been invested in the education of these young people who left are living with them. And from this point of view, this discussion about, and this is why I fear this discussion, because the major clash and the major change that came with the rise of populist sentiment is that everybody should prove that he or she is the ultimate victim. Every country, every concrete group. If you're not a victim, you do not have an identity. If I'm not the most kind of exploited, the most destroyed, and so on. And from this point of view, it's interesting to see how many of these governments are getting support, not for claiming how successful they are, but how badly they're treated. And I find this is a major change.
Let's get practical here.
Okay.
On this out-migration issue.
Yeah.
Obviously, the clearest and simplest answer would be to end the freedom of movement.
No.
This is going to lead to a much higher out migration immediately.
That argument doesn't work in Poland. And actually, I think we are coming to a turning point. Last year, for the first time, we've had a balance of returning, but it's due to a particular reason, namely Brexit. 100,000 people have returned from UK only. But if and Brexit is going to be really important to what we are talking about, because everything is relative. The European Union may seem pathetic and helpless compared to what? If Brexit is a success, but if it's a failure, we'll look like an island of stability. Yeah. So, Brexit plus a recession in Britain and a drop in the pound, but it has to be a really good recession, and we'll get our polls back.
No, but here, I do believe that closing the borders, by the way, psychologically it means the moment you're telling people that even that there is a possibility to close the borders, even people who never thought about leaving are going to leave. But some things could be done. And one of them is exactly this doctor story. Listen, there is a major issue of outflow of doctors and medical personnel, because particularly on the German market there is 100,000 vacancies, and also you have an aging population and so on. So from this point of view, to try to see how you can compensate, even coming with the schemes where people can practice back in their countries. Secondly, Central and East European societies at some point are going to open themselves for foreigners. And from this point of view, Poland is a great example. If you basically listen to the leaders in Central and Eastern Europe, you're going to believe that there is not a single foreigner in their country. Do you know that Poland is the European Union member state who got most labor migrants for the last 3 years? Almost 2 million Ukrainians are working there.
And the million Ukrainians, the representatives of the Polish government will grant you. What even they would find shocking is that their own government, which won the election on the back of a vicious campaign against the possibility of 6,000 Syrians coming to Poland, has now invited 73,000 Bangladeshis, Nepalis and Indians with work visas to Poland. Yeah. This will blow up too. I want to make one argument about what the current Polish government is trying to do as regards the structure of ownership of the economy. So they are trying to reverse that too, with the use of 30 state-controlled companies. We have a unique Polish model of capitalism where the largest 30 companies in the country are on the stock exchange, 60% of the capital is private, but using the 30-something% of the capital, the state actually controls them. And it's a complete fiasco. These companies have lost half and more of their values and have just become places of nepotism and corruption. So the alternative, national capitalism, so far is not working.
But this is the interesting, this is because people talk about sovereignty, nationalism and so on. Paradoxically, when it comes to the economy, these governments are much less kind of nationalistic than you can expect, and Hungary is a great example of this. If you basically listen and the idea of the control and so on, but if you go closer, you're going to see that 30% of the export of Hungary is coming from 4 German companies. And I do believe this is the interesting story. We have a nationalism which is much more symbolic politics and try to control and to divorce the market from the body politics. So this is why I do believe this is quite interesting, and this is why the corruption of the money is and so on. The major crisis of this model is going to come if something goes wrong with the German auto industry. Because paradoxically, it's not simply small businesses, it's not simply brands, but this is very much the supply chain that go for the German auto industry. And I was also surprised to listen how pleased some of these governments have been to President Trump's attack on the German cars and talking about the tariffs. If there are going to be American tariffs on the German cars, believe me, in Bratislava and in Hungary, they're going to feel it stronger than in Germany.
Okay, Ivan, that's all great. Central Europe, let's for a moment shift to the global level here before we open it up to the audience, because I want half an hour for debate here. Now, I'll ask you what I call my Lukyanov question, because Fyodor Lukyanov, one of those self-appointed Kremlin liberals, as they call it, once spoke at a conference in Sopot in Poland, and I asked him the question, well, with all your, what you call realism, what I would call cynicism, there are no universal values. Come on, I mean, let's stop talking about democracy support, this whole 20th century. And my question to him was, okay, so let's say a young guy from Hong Kong comes to me and says, you live in freedom, I don't. Can you help me? So what's going to be my answer? And I added that it doesn't have to be to send the Marines. It can also be a Fulbright scholarship. But there has to be some element of solidarity. And his answer was, well, if you're honest, you tell him, I can't help you. Ivan, my question to you, because you in the very end of your book, you seem at least factual, if not even happy, about the fact that the future is all jostling between countries and political ideas, and the whole preaching, the preaching has ended, or it has to end if it hasn't ended yet. The West should stop preaching and telling the rest of the world how to behave. So how do you match this with this idea that someone in a different part of the world might actually need your help to live the life that he or she aspires to, irrespective of which geographical direction it comes from, that the ideas come from?
Listen, giving solidarity with people that the fighting for their rights is not the same as believing that one day everybody is going to look like you. And from this point of view, you're asking the easy question about Hong Kong. What you're going to do if people come from countries that nominally are democratic? If some of the Indian opposition comes and said, are you going to help me? If Turkish opposition figure comes and asks you. From this point of view, the idea that basically the world is divided between democracies which are the same, all the same, and basically authoritarianism which are all the same is not the case. I do believe, of course, you're helping your friends, and this is nothing more normal than this. It's not only fellowships. You're going to write an article, you're going to help with this, you're going to basically write a petition. What you cannot tell, and this is the difference of 1989, people like Fukuyama all believed genuinely, there is no cynicism or kind of a triumphalism in this, that modernization, as a rule, is going to end up with the political regimes like the Western democracies. And this, I don't believe, is exactly the case. I do believe they're going to develop. I don't believe in the strengths of the authoritarianism as an idea for a very simple reason. We live in a society where people are dissatisfied. With all its weaknesses, democracy is the only regime that allows people to act on their dissatisfaction. So I want to see how the Chinese are going to do when they don't have a growth of 6%, when they're going to have this and that. But from this does not mean that we have a mandate to go and to change these countries. First of all, because if you're telling the Hong Kong we are coming, be sure that we are coming. Because Poland has a great example, 1956, after the Hungarian uprising. This was one of the most storied, Mr. Novak from the Radio Free Europe saying, keep it in mind, we are going to fight, but we are also on our own. And I do believe this is very important, because otherwise, one of the cynicism also comes from many people in different parts of the world, which will believe that we're going to be for them nevertheless of what is happening. And there are the limits of the American power, there is the limits of the European power, and if we're not going to be honest about this, our hypocrisy is going to be used by people like Mr. Putin to show our weakness or our bad will. So it's not about not having solidarity with the people, but it is being more realistic what we can do and what we cannot do.
We are not in the business of changing regimes, but we can express our sympathy for Democrats.
Absolutely.
And in that cause, under the Polish presidency of the EU, we have created an institution called European Endowment for Democracy, which helps supports the unsupported, which I think is the correct model.
Yeah.
So you would subscribe to that?
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Okay. So let's open it up Yes, please introduce yourself briefly and then ask a brief question or make a brief point.
Thank you very much, Roland. Yes. Hello, my name is Pavel Havlíček and I represent a Czech think tank called Association for International Affairs. So weird to hear myself. And a fellow at the German Marshall Fund. I have a question for both of you gentlemen, because major part of foreign policy activities of my country, Czech Republic, but also yours, Radek, is built around the idea of sharing the transition know-how. This is what, in fact, Czechia has been doing in Ukraine, Belarus, the other countries of Eastern Europe, and so on. So my question after your discussion about how imitation brought what it brought, how there are certain second thoughts about transition and so on, is there time to rethink this? Is there time to reconsider this, trying to share this model with our Eastern European neighbors and colleagues, actually? How should we proceed with this one? Thank you.
On this, I have a very simple. One of the lessons that we learned is that imitation always produces resentment. And this is a very valuable lesson too. I do believe we should simply, and this is quite, just one important point, we should be very honest of what we are sharing. It's not about best practices. It's also what we have learned. Because if you see basically the Germans, after 1989, absolutely genuinely decided to share their experience. But here was the story. Their experience, for example, after 1945 to the 1965, was not based on very much coping with the past, as we know, and this is why the 1968 generation did. So the Germans rightly, morally said, no, we're going to share the experience, but the experience is not do what we did, but do what we should have done. And this is important, but you should decide what you are sharing. And also you should allow the people to keep in mind that different places are different and also the different times are different. I don't believe that in Ukraine now you can repeat what was done in Poland in the 1990s. It's simply a different story. And one of the different stories that the West is different, the Hotel Marriott is different, everything is different. So it's going to be much more talking to people and try to be basically giving kind of insights that you get out of it than going with a model and saying, if you're going to do it, it is going to work. Because I don't believe that this is going to work.
Good. Yes, first we start with the gentleman here. That one, sorry. And then you, Marek. Yes.
Thank you, Roland. Thank you, gentlemen, to have this great debate here today. My name is Christian Spar. I've been working with the European Commission in the past 2 years, and before that with CAS in Bulgaria. So a pleasure to be here at this debate. On the way to this event, I read again this interview that Mr. Krastev gave to Michael Martens some time ago. And it's a bit about the perception between Western Europe and Central and Eastern Europe. Basically, I don't share the point of view that we have fundamentally different ideas about Europeanness in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe. But there is certainly a lack of understanding and maybe a lack of communication. Basically not when we look at people here gathered today. I believe most of us have been to Poland, to Bulgaria and to Ukraine. But what do you recommend the Western Europeans, if they want to understand Eastern Europe better? What do you recommend the Central and Eastern European nations or countries or politicians, how to make their voice heard in a better way to overcome this perceived cultural gap in terms of defining Europe?
And I'm sure that Radek also has his view, there is one difference which paradoxically is less commented, which I found quite important, and this is paradoxically the ethnic composition of societies. Go back to the year 1900 and look at the ethnic map of Europe, and you're going to see two Europes. One was quite ethnically homogeneous, and this was Western Europe, Germany, France, and the other was very ethnically and culturally diverse, and this was the Habsburg lands, the Central and Eastern Europe. And then you have 2 world wars, revolution, expulsion of people, destruction of people. And then when you're going to look at it, you're going to see on the map 2 Europes again. One is much more ethnically and culturally diverse, and this is Western Europe. And the other is quite ethnically homogeneous. And this is Central and Eastern Europe. And listen, this is a different experience. This encounters. Quite often, when we talk about foreigners, the difference is that the Westerners talks about foreigners that they see every day, and the Easterners talk about foreigners that they see only on television. I'm always giving this kind of a example, but the Hungarian state-owned polling agency during the refugee crisis made an opinion poll which showed that more Hungarians claim that personally they have seen unidentified flying objects, that they have personally met a refugee. So these are different experiences, and these experiences matter. They're going to change. As we said, now there are going to be almost 100,000 people coming from Sri Lanka and Pakistan and so on in Poland, but this is a difference. And we're talking about advices. I do believe on Central and Eastern Europe, what I don't like on our side is this kind of, we became addicted to see ourselves as a victim, treated as a second-class citizens, and so on. It's a very easy position. I find it first intellectually dishonest, but also it's counterproductive. This kind of a self-victimization all the time. Nobody's listening to us, and so I don't like it. On the other side, I do believe that Western Europe is also going to discover 2 things. Many of the problems that you associate with the East is within the Western societies. The biggest divide in Europe is not between East and West. This is between the major cosmopolitan cities and the other part of the countries. Bratislava, Budapest, Warsaw, Prague are much more part of the West than many parts of the Western societies when you go on the level of attitudes, values, standards of living. So we're talking about something different. And from this point of view, Germany is now rediscovering the Eastern Europe because they discovered East Germany. And this is quite important in my view. And the second is, it means that at the same time, the West cannot see its role as a simply kind of a teacher which is going basically to lecture the students and telling them to do this and that and put them marks. This asymmetrical relationship is over. And paradoxically, European Union helped very much because even the bad students has a veto. So, which is different than in the schools. And from this point of view, I do believe that there should be a much more conversation in which we should get away of our self-victimization. And I do believe the West should stop basically look at the others and asking the questions why they are not like us now, because being like us is different.
Rado.
The patterns of migration are also, and the psychological states that they produce are also influenced by our very different history in the 19th century. Namely, the great majority of ethnic minorities in Western Europe are citizens of former colonies. Yeah. And in Central and Eastern Europe, we were ourselves colonized, even though it was by other white people. Yeah. So what really irks our nationalist traditionalists is the language of political correctness, which is completely understandable in Western Europe because it comes from guilt, of which there's plenty to go about. And so what really gets them going is that we haven't found a language of talking about acceptable levels of migration and what to do to make migrants into good citizens that is not denounced as racism. Yeah. Number one. Number two, there is economic resentment in Poland, even though the last 30 years has been the most successful 30 years in Poland's 1,000-year history. We have never in our history caught up with the living standards of Western Europe at this rate. The top we achieved in the 16th century when we were at 80%. But really it was Gdańsk, Kraków, not the countryside. In 89, we were at 33%. Poland, by comparison with the EU 15 GDP per capita. Today we are at over 70%. But Warsaw, as you say, is at 200%. Warsaw is now on par with Vienna. Poland has per capita income of Portugal, which didn't have World War I, didn't have World War II, and didn't have communism. Okay, amazing. But of course, this is not keeping up with rising expectations, because people see that they are still poorer than the Germans, because the Germans not only have high income, but also they have accumulated wealth. And that takes far, far longer to catch up on. And my last point, that I fear that this is going to get much worse when most of our regions, and we have a couple of borderline ones already in this coming financial perspective, cease to qualify for cohesion funds, and Poland becomes a net contributor. We've already had an inkling what's coming in Polish attitudes to Europe, which scare me. Namely, before the financial crisis, we had 80% support for joining the euro. It's now 30%. It's partly because the Eurozone mismanaged the crisis, but I think it's more precisely about something else. We have the attitudes of someone who is only just becoming middle class. And it's very fragile still, and we are still not ready to share. Yeah. And so the killer argument against the euro in Poland is, look at Slovakia. Slovakia was potentially contributing to a fund to help Greece, which is richer than us. And that can't be right. So when we become net contributors, there's a huge work to be done in advance to say, to do the homework that the French and the Germans and others have done, that, yeah, we may be financially in cash terms contributors, but there are bigger advantages that create this rolling system of countries being integrated and helping our prosperity. But that argument has not been made in Poland.
This is, by the way, critically important, because I do believe that this goes also to your question on practicalities. Russian President Mr. Putin said that the European Union is going to disintegrate in 2028. When 2028. So okay. When he said basically the Central and East European countries are stopping to be the receivers of funds, and some of them are going to be pushed on this. I don't believe that it's going to happen exactly like this, but the story is the following. If we're going to justify European integration simply in financial terms, if the money are produced as something that we reward or we punish only, then we should not be surprised that people are going to react like this. For me, this is important. And on the level of the joke, for Bulgarians, it's more difficult with this catching up, because in the 9th century, we're doing very well. So we cannot reach the level of catch up. Then we believe that the West was catching up. And now we are still basically comparing to this period. I have noticed that the interesting story with the nationalism in our countries is that people are more and more interested to periods that we don't know anything about. To the extent that one of our colleagues was saying that in the Bulgarian lands, there were Bulgarians before there were people.
Projection into the past, into the distant past is always easy. Just one point about what's going to happen in 2028. Well, one thing I predict, the German government is going to argue for an ambitious budget of the European Union. Okay. We take several questions in a row because we're running out of time. The first one was Marek, right? Yeah. And then we have to go to Paweł Świeboda, then you, and then we go over to this side. Go ahead.
Mark Dąbrowski-Brugel. I have just one remark related to ownership structure. It's true that in countries which are members of the EU or candidates to the EU, dominant ownership of larger enterprises are transnational corporations. Local ownership is mostly of small and medium-sized enterprises. And from time to time, I am not sure how frequently, how strongly, this is useful argument in hands of populism. I am not sure that is most important, but it's coming back from time to time. But I think that, to be fair, we also should realize what is alternative and what's the price of this alternative. Alternative is Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, perhaps China, where there are large enterprises owned domestically. There are their own trademarks, brands, etc. But the price is the oligarchy, economic political oligarchy, and I am not sure whether this is so attractive alternative. And maybe one more small remarks, what you mentioned, Radek, about the structure of Warsaw Stock Exchange. This is exactly structure of Moscow Stock Exchange for the last 15 years.
Very good. Paweł Świeboda is next.
Ask a question about the broader European agenda, because I think there is a tension there between imitation and innovation as well. If you add the time axis, there is a lot of imitation or attempt of imitation of the glorious or supposedly glorious past, and then it's called nostalgia. There is imitation at the European level of some of the competences of the member states. Look at the border protection discussion. This is basically yearning for some of the tools which the member states have. So that's imitation. But of course, the EU is fundamentally about innovation. It's an innovative project in itself. And if you look at the current agenda, it's probably more innovative than it has been for a while. The Green Deal is the most innovative project and transformative one that has probably ever been put on the table. It's a high risk, high rewards type of project, but there it is. Technology, also Europe wants to cast its own way. So how do you see the balance shaping up between the two against the background of a political fragmentation and polarization, because that's pretty much the situation in Europe, that some of our countries are polarized and those that are not polarized are fragmented?
Alice next, right here.
Thank you. My name is Alice Stolmeyer. I work for Defending Democracy. Based on what you just said, what would be your advice to President Ursula von der Leyen and President Charles Michel on how to deal with the crisis on rule of law in Poland? And I know that some Polish people say, well, that's our internal business, but I really do think that this affects all of us because it's about the legal order, which is interconnected. Thank you.
Great. We had, yes, the gentleman in the second row right here.
Thank you very much. My name is Wolfgang Pape. I was in the Commission before. Now I'm still associated with CEPS, the Center for European Policy Studies here in Brussels. I have a very short question. You very frequently and very strongly use the term the West. Yes. Isn't there a void? Because we see more and more, and it's not only Wolfgang Ischinger in Munich recently using the term Westlessness. What is the West nowadays? Thank you.
Excellent question. We have the gentleman here in the fourth row, right here.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Jan Jereš. I'm from the Czech Defense Ministry, but of course representing only myself here. I have a question for Mr. Krastev. Actually, it's clear that what you bring into the debate is very valuable. You have developed a great number of excellent insight into what has been going on over the past 30 years, especially in Europe. But actually, taking it all together, I somehow struggle to understand what is actually the problem you want to address by all of this, if there is any problem you see. I don't really understand it, because imitation, okay, and it has already been said here in one way or another that actually, in a sense, the imitation you described that has been going on in Central and East Europe since 1989, it can be actually argued that it has been a remarkably successful thing, Of course, the outcomes have been very different because this is not a homogeneous region. These countries are very different, so there are huge differences between the performance of different Central European countries. But you can very legitimately say that for many countries it has been a smashing success. You personally are a great example of very successful imitation. You are a very good imitation of a Western liberal think tanker. So what is the problem?
Actually, deceptively real.
Thank you.
Thank you
Something
for
of
that
a
question.
double-edged compliment.
Last point by the gentleman all the way in the back. And then we come to the panel.
Thank you. Coming from the other edge of Europe, from Portugal. A couple of questions. First, a comment on what you were saying. Yes, in 2004, we suddenly became statistically richer because of the Eastern and Central European countries, and obviously the country wasn't prepared to start sharing. And luckily we became poorer again, so we now are in the receiving end. But we do compare with the Central and Eastern European countries, and we try to see what happened. But now trying to understand what's going on that side of Europe, which I've visited often, but I don't know that well. One of the issues that strikes me is something that you were discussing about the imitation, and well, you cannot compare it to Portugal, Sweden, they also had to imitate. Isn't one of the main differences the issue of sovereignty, the sense, in this sense, when we joined the European Union, we had been an independent country for ages, 800 years. The Swedes, the Danes, everyone else hadn't had a problem of sovereignty before joining the EU, whereas Central and European countries had experienced a lack of sovereignty. And if the role of nationalists was that important in the revolution, wasn't there a bigger expectation of gaining sovereignty and then having the belief that it's not happening is one of the causes? And if so, could trying to show people that there's more in the EU than just collecting money would be help. Second issue is about the West again. Yes, in 1989 there was a belief that the West meant something. There was a belief in the West and its products. Isn't the fact that we no longer believe so much that the West is worth something that helps or makes it more difficult to have a story to tell? Thank you.
All right, we have to finish at this point. I mean, we'll have the answers from the panel. No more questions from the audience, sorry. Radek, you're the first to answer. Just pick a few points.
Sure. I think there's a common thread in the story of the Polish courts, Portugal, and Europe as an innovative project. And it is to do with sovereignty, or I would argue with a fundamental constitutional problem that we have in Europe. When I go on to meetings with my constituents in Poland and they ask me your question, I tell them the following. Imagine Marine Le Pen wins in France and passes a patriotic law that in future, whenever in a French court there is a dispute between a French citizen and a foreigner, the French citizen wins. And now remember that there are disputes between Polish mothers and French fathers over children. There are disputes between Polish and French companies over migrant workers and stuff like that. There are all kinds of disputes. Would you then trust the French court, and would you agree to send a Polish citizen without trial in Poland, without the extradition procedure, under a European arrest warrant to stand trial in France? Oh, no, then we wouldn't. I think that illustrates the point. The European Union is based on mutual trust in the quality of institutions. And that's why the independence of Polish courts is necessarily European business. Because if you don't have legal certainty in one member state, it'll spill out. And our worst nightmares are coming true. First, judges are being prosecuted, not just expelled, prosecuted for verdicts that they pass that the ruling party doesn't like. That's terrible. And there's just been, last week I published a list of persecutions of Polish prosecutors and judges. And of course we should settle it in Poland. But it's kind of difficult when they first took over the Constitutional Court, then the prosecution service, then the system of disciplining judges, and in next month they'll probably capture the Supreme Court, which is as Chairman Kaczynski said, it's the last barricade
of the globalized elites.
Which they need mainly to give themselves immunity for what they're doing. But it will also, for example, enable them to prosecute Tusk for participation in the Smolensk assassination of Kaczynski's brother. You see, you couldn't do it as long as prosecutors and the courts were European, but if they're under control, then you can do it. But there's very little the European Union can do about it, because we are ultimately a confederation. And a confederation means that sovereignty ultimate sovereignty, as the British have proven, remains in the member states. So we have this tension that I've studied this with my students at Harvard. We've looked at past confederations, including the American one. They started as a confederation. All historical confederations either became federations or they collapsed. And there's a reason for that. Under a confederation, because members of it are sovereign, inevitably they cheat. And our member states also cheat. Member states, including the biggest ones, cheated against the Growth and Stability Pact. That's why we had the Eurozone crisis. And some member states were unable to or unwilling to hold the line of the Schengen zone. That's why we had the migration crisis. Today, member states are cheating on the Lisbon Treaty and actually doing their own foreign policy when we've pledged ourselves to do common foreign policy. But this is our tragedy, that which is necessary for our survival has become politically impossible.
Ivan, last word.
Yeah, thank you very much. Several very good questions. Let's start with, by the way, extremely legitimate question coming from the colleague from the Czech Defense Ministry. First of all, imitation could be success, as you can see in my case. But also, what is important is, and no, I do believe that your question is absolutely fair. But the question is the following. If it is success, why then so many voters in our countries vote for parties that claim that transition was failure? If we decide not to address this question and to say that people basically don't understand, and
false consciousness,
I'm not buying this. So from this point of view, I'm trying to come with the explanation, and part of this explanation is, listen, it's more complex. There was a success, and this success is real. There is also this psychological turn, and this is why imitation for me is important, not on the level of the individual behavior, but on the level of this particular moment which came after the end of the Cold War, which we're talking about. And I very much agree with the question of the West. At the end of the Age of the Imitation, the West does not exist. And not simply because a certain guy was elected in the United States or here and there, but because the role of the West as the model that everybody is going to imitate is not there anymore, for good or for bad. And then I'll go to the question about imitation and innovation, because I find it very important. In 2018, Bertelsmann did this study all over EU member states, showing that the majority of the people in all countries believe that we have been living better before. When before, different for different people, but this nostalgia is very strong, and this is critically important because also the study shows us that the more nostalgic the people are, the more ready they are to vote for the far right. One of the paradoxes of the far right is that this is the absence of political project about the future. You want to stop time. And from this point of view, it's interesting, and on the climate change, and this is why on the innovation, I have probably a particular reading, and this comes also to what the Commission is trying to achieve. I do believe that the interesting story about climate change, when you're not talking about climate, is the way to try to reinvent the soft power of the European Union. European Union, unlike the United States, Russia, China, India, is much more threatened by the disintegration of the liberal order because we are not a normal state. If you're going basically to reassert sovereignty as the major principle, it's going to come back to us as an internal problem. So from this point of view, the climate politics is the only politics in which it's very difficult to claim that you can have a zero-sum game. By the way, at the same time, the climate politics is going to put a huge pressure on everybody doing democracy support. Because if climate is the most important thing that we should fight for, what is more important in our relations with China? For the Chinese to get more democratic or to reduce their pollution levels? No, and this is really at the heart of the issue.
But we've lost the bet on
yeah,
China already.
Yeah, but why I'm saying that it's important for reinventing the soft power of the EU is because in a certain way, policy is not simply what you are doing, but also how you're justifying your actions. And I do believe that the climate politics is giving a different language to the EU, in which you really can claim and try to interfere, including in the politics of a bigger states outside of us, based on the idea of a global common interest, which is climate-based. And even if we're going to be pushed into a much more protectionist world, it's better to try to justify our protection politics on the best of climate than on the best of many other things that other countries are doing. So from this point of view, I see the climate politics as an innovation, which is not simply driven by the recognition of the importance of the climate issue, but this is the innovation as position of the Commission and of the European Union to reposition itself globally. Because if something has changed, and this is my last point, listen, 10 years ago, when we looked at the world, the question is how we can transform the world around us. And now, being Bulgarian and seeing what is happening on the Greek-Turkish border, the question is different. How not to allow the world around us to transform us? So what yesterday was perceived as our universalism is now very much perceived as our exceptionalism. And I do believe this is quite important from this point of view to ask, in my view, the most important question: how you could be universalist if you are not very powerful? And this is for me a real issue.
That's an absolutely great question, probably for the next seminar that we're going to hold and the next panel. I would like to just to give a summary and comment at the same time. I actually don't believe in the separation of this question. Can we transform the world, or is the world transforming us? Ultimately, it is the same question. And, you know, frankly speaking, of course the end of history in 1989 was hubris. Of course it is not ending. But we've been before at a point when the West seemed tired, worn out, actually belonging to the past. You know, that was about 100 years ago. The guru of my grandfather was a guy named Oswald Spengler, who wrote a 3-volume work on the decline of the West. And yes, in those days, indeed, authoritarian movements from the left and the right, collectivists of all political shades, seemed much younger and fresher than those tired democracies. And you know what followed? And you know what followed? Which was a huge comeback. And this is my final remark. The West has this sometimes amazing, and to its detractors, annoying quality of bouncing back when you least expect it. So on that happy note, I'd like to thank you for participating here. Thank our excellent speakers.
So the West is like Biden.
Exactly.
Always coming back.
We're the comeback kid. Thank you very much. Thanks. Have a nice day.